Greetings, friend, and welcome. So glad you could join us for Bedtime Biographies, where together we unwind and drift away to the soothing accounts of truly remarkable lives. Our journey this evening begins in the scorching heat of colonial Algeria. The Mediterranean sun beats down on whitewashed buildings, where a boy with tuberculosis-scarred lungs kicks a football through dusty streets. His name, Albert Camus. His mission, to explain why life feels meaningless, and why, just maybe, that's exactly what makes it worth living. Before we properly begin Camus' story, just a brief thought. If these calm explorations of significant lives help you unwind, please consider taking a moment to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps other curious minds discover these stories. And we're always curious for your reflections. Let us know in the comments below what you think of Camus and which historical figure you'd like us to explore in our next bedtime biography.
Now, absurdism gets thrown around a lot, sometimes as pessimism, sometimes as nihilism. But strip away the noise, and at its heart, it's really just a question. What if the universe has no meaning, but we can still choose joy? What if accepting life's fundamental absurdity is the first step toward genuine freedom? Camus spent his life wrestling with that tension through novels, essays, and a pack-a-day cigarette habit. Of course, history simplified his philosophy into catchphrases: the myth of Sisyphus, the stranger who feels nothing, the rebel without a cause. But tonight, we are not here for the clichés. We're just here to meet the man behind the myth. A passionate, contradictory, deeply human thinker who believed happiness and despair could coexist. And now, as the day winds down, let's begin to trace the life and times of this deeply influential thinker. This is the bedtime biography of Albert Camus. Chapter 1: The Boy Who Would Question Everything. The story begins in 1913 in Mondovì, a small town in French Algeria, where colonial France and North African culture collided like waves against rocky shores. Here, in a modest farmhouse surrounded by vineyards, a boy named Albert Camus took his first breaths. His father, Lucien, was a cellar worker with calloused hands and few words. A man who would die at the Battle of the Marne before young Albert turned 1, leaving behind only a shell fragment in a biscuit tin and the faintest ghost of memory. Young Albert would inherit that absence, along with something far more formative: poverty so deep it shaped everything. The Camus household was nearly silent. His mother, Catherine, a cleaning woman of Spanish descent, was partially deaf and nearly mute, her days measured in scrubbed floors and exhausted sighs. His grandmother ruled the tiny apartment in the working-class Belcourt district with iron discipline and sharp slaps. Young Albert absorbed it all: the silence, the struggle, the sense that the world gave nothing freely. By the time he reached primary school, his teachers noted 2 things. First, that the boy wrote with startling emotional depth for his age, and second, that he possessed what one instructor called a ferocious hunger for understanding why things were the way they were. At 10, his teacher Louis Germain recognized something special, convincing Albert's grandmother to let him sit for the lycée scholarship exam. It was as if the young man already sensed the theme that would consume his life: that our earthly struggles matter precisely because nothing else does. His schoolmaster, perhaps sensing greatness ahead, wrote in Albert's leaving certificate that while the student showed brilliance, his work suffered from an overabundance of questions without easy answers. Meanwhile, the Algerian coast around him whispered of contradictions. Roman ruins stood alongside Arab markets, all overshadowed by French colonial administration. The tensions piled up like the Mediterranean waves, colonizer and colonized, rich and poor, meaning and meaninglessness. Camus would spend his life dissecting such contradictions, though he couldn't have known it yet. For now, he was simply a bright young man with weak lungs and a restlessness that no amount of Mediterranean sun could soothe. His family dreamed he'd become a teacher, respectable, stable, a way out of Belcourt's crushing poverty. But the boy who had grown up between silence and philosophy books, between Arab neighbors and French schooling, was already nursing questions too dangerous for easy answers. In 1930, he entered the lycée, carrying a second-hand satchel, a head full of curiosity, and a body already marked by tuberculosis. The quiet streets of Belcourt would see him only occasionally after that, the prodigal son returning between adventures, each time a little more convinced that life's meaninglessness was not something to fear, but something to embrace. The rest, as they say, was absurdity waiting to be discovered. Chapter 2. The Goalkeeper Who Loved the Sun. The lycée years arrived like a revelation, awakening something fierce in young Camus. Algiers in the 1930s was all sun-bleached boulevards and Mediterranean breezes, a far cry from Belcourt's cramped poverty. 17-year-old Albert dove in head first, playing goalkeeper for the racing Universitaire d'Alger football team, devouring philosophy texts, even falling passionately in love with a morphine-addicted bohemian named Simone Hier. His body protested every step, tuberculosis flaring in his lungs, leaving him gasping between games and lectures. But Camus wasn't destined for a quiet life. By 1933, he'd discovered philosophy like a drowning man discovering air, particularly the work of Soren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche. The University of Algiers lecture halls smelled of chalk and possibility, humming with ideas about existence, meaning, and the void beneath everything. These thinkers electrified Camus. He joined leftist student groups, a circle of passionate rebels who debated colonialism and inequality late into warm North African nights. Days blurred into football matches and fevered discussions about whether life had any inherent purpose. The transformation was startling. The scholarship boy who'd arrived with dreams of a teaching certificate now scribbled passionate essays about the death of God and the birth of individual responsibility. His grandmother, watching this philosophical rebellion unfold, grew frantic. "For heaven's sake," she pleaded, "when will you stop filling your head with these depressing French intellectuals and get a proper job?" But Camus had already charted his course. He stopped attending required lectures, letting his official studies drift while he devoured existentialism, ancient philosophy, and Christian theology. By 1936, Camus was researching his thesis on Christian metaphysics and Neoplatonism, a deep dive into how Western thought had grappled with meaning and transcendence.
He submitted it at just 23, despite tuberculosis forcing him to abandon dreams of teaching since he couldn't pass the health requirements. The newly minted philosophy graduate imagined an academic career, but his body and history had other ideas. When his marriage to Simone collapsed under the weight of her addiction and his poverty, Camus understood the ivory tower gates were closed to him. And so the young philosopher stepped onto a different path, one that led not to lecture halls, but to radical journalism, theatrical rebellion, and eventually into a philosophy that would define modern thought. But that discovery, like so much else, would have to wait. For now, Camus left the university with a degree he couldn't fully use, ideas too dangerous for colonial Algeria, and a restlessness that would carry him across continents and into immortality. The Gold Keeper was about to become a prophet of the absurd. The tuberculosis would continue, but now it be accompanied by something far more potent, a growing conviction that life without meaning was still life worth living, perhaps the only life worth living at all. Chapter 3: The Journalist Who Defied an Empire. The ink-stained rebel found his first battleground not in philosophy seminars, but in the pages of a struggling leftist newspaper. Algiers, 1938. Camus, now 25 and brimming with moral fury, took a position at Alger Républicain, the anti-colonial publication that became his laboratory. Each article a carefully aimed dart at French imperialism. He wrote about the Kabylia famine, where Berber families starved while colonial administrators looked away, documented police brutality, and slowly honed his signature style, that potent mix of lyrical prose and righteous anger. His reporting on Kabylia became legendary. Camus traveled to remote villages, documenting starvation wages and systematic exploitation with forensic precision. He described children with distended bellies, families surviving on roots and hope, colonial officials shrugging at the misery. The series ran for weeks, each installment more damning than the last. Colonial authorities were not amused. When Camus defended Arab defendants in political trials, his first serious engagement with colonial injustice, the administration pounced. The paper was pressured, advertisers fled, and by 1940, Alger Républicain was effectively neutered. Camus, now blacklisted across French Algeria, faced a choice: silence or exile. He chose exile with typical resolve, moving to Paris that spring to work for Paris Soir just as Nazi Germany prepared to invade France. Paris in 1940 was revelation and nightmare combined. The air smelled of impending catastrophe and cheap tobacco, its streets emptying as German troops approached. Here, Camus discovered something Algeria had never allowed, a space where ideas could breathe, but also where history could suffocate everything. He plunged into the city's intellectual underground, though the underground was literally underground now. Resistance fighters and banned writers meeting in basements and back rooms. It was during these fevered months that Camus began his lifelong project, understanding how to live authentically in an indifferent universe. Late one evening, hunched over a desk in a borrowed apartment, Camus showed a friend his latest notes.
"These French existentialists," he muttered, "they philosophize beautifully but lose themselves in abstraction." His fingers traced connections between personal experience and universal truth, between the sun-drenched beaches of Algeria and the cold streets of occupied Paris. That lesson would stay with Camus as wartime sharpened his thinking. He began writing The Stranger, a novel about a man who kills without clear motive and refuses to pretend remorse. The book's startling conclusion, honesty about life's meaninglessness, is more authentic than comforting lies. As winter settled over occupied France, Camus' resolve grew stronger, his critiques sharper.
German officials took note of the troublesome young Algerian asking dangerous questions at café discussions. By 1942, his tuberculosis flared again, forcing him to retreat to the mountains. He didn't know it yet, but his years of philosophical wandering were crystallizing into something revolutionary. Nor could he guess that his most famous essay, about a Greek king condemned to roll a boulder uphill forever, waited just around the corner. The radical journalist was about to become philosophy's most eloquent voice for embracing life's fundamental absurdity. Chapter 4: The Philosopher Who Found Meaning in Meaninglessness. The encounter that would alter Camus' life happened not through a person, but through an idea. A mountain village in France, winter 1941, where tubercular lungs forced him into exile within exile. Jean Grenier, his former philosophy teacher, had suggested he read the Greek myth of Sisyphus, the king condemned by gods to push a boulder uphill forever, only to watch it roll back down for eternity. Camus, bedridden and coughing, found himself staring at the ultimate image of futility. As he wrote, something crystallized. The myth of Sisyphus began as an essay about suicide, philosophy's fundamental question. If life has no inherent meaning, why not end it? But Camus' answer was radical. Precisely because life is absurd, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. The struggle itself becomes the meaning. "We finished each other's sentences," Camus would later say about the months spent crafting this essay, referring to his dialogue with the ancient myth.
Their partnership, thinker and myth, became the engine of absurdist philosophy. Sisyphus, the eternal laborer condemned to meaningless repetition, grounded abstract philosophy in visceral image. Camus, the relentless questioner, transformed that punishment into a metaphor for liberation. Together, they created something revolutionary, a philosophy that said yes to life precisely because it means nothing. The essay, published in 1942 alongside The Stranger, hit French intellectual circles like a philosophical grenade. Here was a thinker saying the universe is indifferent, meaning is a human invention, and death renders everything ultimately pointless, but we should embrace life anyway, not despite its absurdity, but because of it. The only true freedom comes from accepting the absurd and living fully anyway. But their bond, myth and philosopher, went beyond intellect. Camus wasn't offering abstract comfort. He was describing his own experience. The working-class boy who watched his mother clean floors in silence. The tuberculosis patient told his body was betraying him. the colonial subject watching empire pretend its brutality had purpose. Absurdism wasn't pessimism. It was the hard-won wisdom of someone who'd stared into the void and chosen to laugh. And when Camus needed to test his theories against reality, occupied France became his laboratory. He joined the resistance, writing for the underground newspaper Combat. The absurdity was perfect, risking everything for a cause in a meaningless universe. But that was precisely the point. We create meaning through our choices and commitments, not by discovering some pre-existing cosmic purpose.
By 1943, his ideas had crystallized enough to attract both admirers and critics. At a clandestine meeting of resistance intellectuals, Camus articulated his philosophy aloud. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need for meaning and the unreasonable silence of the world. We must live in that tension. The assembled fighters leaned forward. This wasn't just philosophy, it was a survival manual for impossible times. The thinker and the myth, the rebel and his boulder. A partnership that began in a mountain sick room would go on to reshape how millions understood existence. The absurd hero wasn't someone who conquered meaninglessness, but someone who accepted it fully and chose joy anyway, funded, ironically, by nothing more than human defiance against an indifferent cosmos.
Chapter 5. 150 pages that changed how we see the world. The Parisian underground had been whispering about meaning and existence for years, scattered networks of existentialists and phenomenologists meeting in smoke-filled cafes. But when Camus arrived in 1942 with the Stranger manuscript, the whispers became gasps. The book, barely 150 pages, wasn't asking whether life had meaning. It was assuming it didn't and watching what happened next. That year, in occupied Paris, Camus' cramped apartment became philosophy's unofficial testing ground. Friends read drafts of this strange novel about Meursault, a French Algerian who attends his mother's funeral without crying, has a casual affair, then kills an Arab man on a sun-blasted beach, seemingly because the sun was too bright. At the trial, Meursault is condemned less for murder than for his honesty, his refusal to pretend grief he didn't feel or remorse that seemed false.
The novel was less a story than a philosophical bomb. Meursault isn't a monster, he's radically honest in a world that demands comforting lies. The writing crackled with spare, almost journalistic prose. Maman died today. Or yesterday, maybe, I don't know. It painted society as demanding emotional performances, while the protagonist refuses to perform. The book's startling conclusion: authentic existence means accepting life's meaninglessness without flinching. When Gallimard published The Stranger in June 1942, France was deep in occupation darkness. Camus, working for the resistance newspaper Combat, seemed prophetic. The novel's exploration of alienation and moral freedom resonated with people living under fascism's boot, where traditional meanings had collapsed.
But the real explosion came from The Myth of Sisyphus, published the same year. While The Stranger showed absurdism through fiction, the essay explained it philosophically. Camus argued that recognizing life's absurdity was the beginning of freedom, not the end. We must imagine Sisyphus happy, he concluded, because the struggle itself becomes our purpose. Critics were divided immediately. Existentialists like Sartre initially praised Camus as an ally, though that friendship would spectacularly implode later. Catholic intellectuals condemned him for removing God from the equation. Communist critics called him bourgeois for ignoring class struggle. Yet underground, something curious happened. Resistance fighters passed copies hand to hand. A philosophy born from powerlessness became a manual for resistance. Liberation approached in 1944. Camus' name was everywhere. Combat, the resistance paper he now edited openly, ran his essays demanding justice and warning against revenge. The man who'd argued life had no inherent meaning was now insisting we must create meaning through ethical action. The seeming contradiction was the point. We're free precisely because nothing is predetermined. Camus couldn't know then that his slim novel and essay would echo across decades. For now, there was only the chaos of liberation, the questions of how to rebuild, and the slow, stubborn work of living authentically in an absurd world. The philosopher who'd declared life meaningless was about to become his generation's conscience, proving that accepting absurdity doesn't mean abandoning morality. It means taking full responsibility for it.
Chapter 6. The Rebel's Conscience. Paris in the late 1940s greeted Camus like an uncomfortable crown. His cramped left-bank apartment smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke, the walls covered with newspaper clippings and manuscript drafts. Camus, now famous and intensely uncomfortable with fame, spent his mornings at Café de Flore, surrounded by other intellectuals, but somehow always alone. The café's regular patrons knew him as that Algerian writer who occupied the corner table, chain-smoking Gauloise while editing Combat and grappling with the moral aftermath of war. At home, the reality was complicated. His tuberculosis returned with vengeance, forcing sanatorium stays that separated him from his wife Francine and their twin children. Camus felt like a fraud, the moralist who'd become famous preaching authenticity while maintaining a secret affair with actress Maria Caceres. He wrote in journals about being split between his public role as philosophy's conscience and his private chaos, his lungs struggling with each breath as he struggled with each moral question.
Yet, in this personal turmoil, Camus was assembling what would become his most important political work. The notes he scribbled in cafes, filled with historical research and moral urgency, were the first threads of The Rebel. He wrote obsessively, often pacing his apartment to stay awake, the sounds of post-war reconstruction drifting through open windows. When Stalin's Gulag system became undeniable, Camus poured his anguish into work, telling friends, "I must understand how revolutions become tyrannies." The manuscript grew in fits and starts, interrupted by tuberculosis flare-ups and his increasing isolation from former allies. Through it all, his fame became a burden. Publishers wanted another stranger. Sartre's circle expected political alignment. Communist intellectuals demanded he ignore Soviet crimes for the sake of the revolution.
Camus refused all of it, insisting we must name evil wherever it appears, even when it appears in causes we support.
By 1949, his relationship with Sartre was fraying. Their public debate about ends justifying means became legendary. Sartre argued political necessities sometimes require violence. Camus countered that no end justifies murder, that accepting revolutionary terror because it promises utopia was precisely the logic that created gulags. Their letters chronicled the death of a friendship and the birth of a philosophical schism that would define post-war thought. But something had shifted in those years of public prominence and private doubt. The man who emerged from the late 1940s was no longer the young absurdist declaring life meaningless. He'd evolved into something more complex, a philosopher insisting that recognizing life's absurdity created moral responsibility, not excused it. The universe doesn't care, Camus now argued, which means we must care even more.
The early 1950s found him increasingly isolated. When The Rebel published in 1951, criticizing revolutionary violence from both left and right, former allies attacked viciously. Sartre's journal published a savage review. Communist intellectuals called him a traitor to the working class. Right-wing critics dismissed him as naively idealistic. And Camus, the eternal outsider, found himself again in exile, not geographically, but intellectually, defending moral limits in an age of ideological absolutes. The man who'd once written that we must imagine Sisyphus happy now understood the weight of that boulder more intimately. The struggle to maintain moral clarity in a world demanding ideological purity had become his Sisyphean task. And like his Greek hero, he kept pushing, alone, certain the struggle itself mattered precisely because nothing else did.
Chapter 7: The Exile Writing Home. By the early 1950s, Camus had become a permanent fixture of Paris's intellectual scene, but felt increasingly distant from it. The bearded, chain-smoking figure haunting left-bank cafes, the Algerian writer who never quite belonged in metropolitan France. His colleagues knew his routine: arrive at combat offices, argue with editors about moral compromises, retreat to write in the afternoon light streaming through his study window. His fame had grown, his influence undeniable, but his sense of alienation deepened. The writing process became his refuge and torture both. The Fall, his strange confessional novel, grew like an extended therapy session. Its protagonist, Jean-Baptiste Clements, is a former lawyer who confesses his moral failures while drinking in an Amsterdam bar, creating a portrait of modern guilt and bad faith. Camus wrote it in fragments, standing at his desk when sitting aggravated his lungs, his letters to friends reading like philosophical diaries. "The damned irony," he wrote Maria Casares, "is that I've become exactly what I warned against, a public moralist with private failures."
Meanwhile, Algeria was burning. The independence movement that began in 1954 was tearing apart Camus' homeland. He watched from Paris as violence escalated on both sides, French colonials and Arab nationalists locked in brutal conflict. His mother still lived in Algiers, silent and vulnerable. His childhood friends were divided. Everything he'd written about colonialism's injustice collided with his horror at terrorism targeting civilians. The political pressure was suffocating. Leftist friends demanded he support Algerian independence without qualification. Right-wing critics expected him to defend French Algeria. Both sides wanted simple positions. Camus offered complex anguish instead. He called for a civil truce, a ceasefire to protect civilians. Both sides ignored him. When he published his appeal in 1956, bombs answered.
His most infamous quote came from this period. At his Nobel Prize acceptance in Stockholm, a student accused him of ignoring Algerian suffering. Camus responded, "I believe in justice, but I will defend my mother before justice." Critics weaponized this forever, claiming he chose colonialism over morality. The truth was more tragic. He was a man torn between abstract justice and lived love, paralyzed by the recognition that righteousness from Paris couldn't protect his mother from bombs in Algiers. Through these years of political agony, Camus kept writing. His unfinished novel, The First Man, became an excavation of his Algerian childhood, a desperate attempt to explain the place that made him to a world that saw only politics. He wrote about poverty that transcended ethnic divisions, childhood friendships between French and Arab boys, the complicated humanity colonialism tried to erase.
The manuscript consumed him. He filled notebooks with memories, his grandmother's slaps, his teacher's kindness, football games at sunset, his mother's silent suffering. This wasn't political analysis, but something rawer. A middle-aged philosopher trying to understand the boy he'd been, the place that shaped him, before history's violence rendered it incomprehensible. By 1959, Camus was exhausted. The Nobel Prize hadn't brought clarity, just more attention he didn't want. The Algerian crisis had no solution he could articulate. His tuberculosis was manageable but permanent, a constant reminder of mortality. The philosopher who'd argued we must imagine Sisyphus happy was discovering how heavy that boulder could become. He retreated to Lourmarin, a village in Provence, buying a small house where he could write away from Paris's pressures. The man who'd once thrived on intellectual combat now sought silence. The final irony, the philosopher of engagement choosing withdrawal, the champion of the absurd seeking peace from absurdity itself. The boulder had become unbearable, but he kept pushing, uncertain why, but certain he must.
Chapter 8. The Playwright Who Staged Rebellion. Paris, January 1944. A darkened theatre near the Latin Quarter, where a curious play is about to premiere, despite German censors prowling for anything subversive. The Misunderstanding tells the story of a man murdered by his own family, who failed to recognize him. A meditation on alienation so complete it becomes murderous. Albert Camus was deeply involved in its production, this time not as distant author, but as hands-on theatrical practitioner, philosophy's conscience moonlighting as drama's provocateur. Theatre became Camus' laboratory for testing ideas through lived experience. Unlike novels you read alone or essays you debate in cafes, theatre gathered people together in darkness to witness stories unfold in real time. He'd founded his own company back in Algeria, the Théâtre du Travail, staging politically charged productions that got him investigated by colonial police. Now in liberated Paris, he returned to that passion with renewed urgency. His adaptation of Caligula, written before the war but produced in 1945, became his most famous theatrical work. The Roman emperor who discovers life's meaninglessness and decides to live that truth absolutely, exercising power without limits because limits are human inventions anyway. Caligula becomes a monster of logic, murdering randomly to prove freedom from conventional morality. The play's dark question, what happens when someone actually lives absurdism without ethical restraint? Audiences watched in stunned silence as Caligula descended into tyranny, horrified to see absurdism's potential for evil. That was precisely Camus' point. The play dramatized the crucial difference between recognizing life's meaninglessness and using that recognition to justify cruelty. Caligula fails because he mistakes freedom from meaning for freedom from responsibility. He becomes the cautionary tale for Camus' philosophy. His theatrical work expanded through the late 1940s. He adapted Faulkner's Requiem for a Nun, wrestling with American Gothic's Catholic guilt through an absurdist lens. He directed Dostoevsky's The Possessed, seeing in Russian revolutionary nihilism a warning for his own era. Each production explored the same territory. How do we live ethically in a world without transcendent meaning? The physical work of theatre suited him. Camus loved the collaborative chaos of rehearsals, actors and director collectively creating meaning from scripts. It was absurdism made concrete. Human beings gathering in darkness to create temporary significance together, then dispersing back into meaningless existence. Every performance was Sisyphus pushing his boulder, beautiful because temporary. But his theatrical vision sometimes clashed with practical realities. Actors complained he pushed too hard for philosophical precision at the expense of dramatic flow. Directors he worked with found him controlling, unable to let his visions be interpreted freely. His State of Siege, a fever dream allegory about plague and totalitarianism, flopped badly in 1948, leaving Camus devastated. Apparently, audiences wanted entertainment more than existential dread. Through it all, theatre remained his passion project, the place where philosophy met lived experience. When The Just Assassins premiered in 1949, examining Russian terrorists who killed a Grand Duke, audiences finally engaged. The play asked whether killing for justice makes you a murderer or a hero, whether revolutionary violence can be morally pure. No easy answers emerged, just complicated human beings making impossible choices in impossible situations. By the early 1950s, Camus was stepping back from active theatrical work, exhausted by the political fights and disappointed by audiences' tepid responses. But his time in theatre had taught him something crucial. Ideas don't exist in abstract space, but in human hearts, making choices under pressure. The philosopher who declared life absurd had learned through theatre that meaning emerges in how we act together in shared time and space. The stage was his temple, and like all temples, it celebrated something simultaneously sacred and utterly invented. Chapter 9. October 1957. The Prize He Didn't Want. Stockholm,
December 1957. The air smells of winter and ceremony, an unlikely combination that perfectly captures the moment. Albert Camus, age 43, stands before Swedish royalty and international press to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature. He looks uncomfortable in formal attire, cigarette conspicuously absent for once, his acceptance speech trembling slightly in his hands. Here, unexpectedly, is history recognizing the Algerian outsider who'd spent his career questioning everything, including whether recognition meant anything at all. Camus nearly choked on his coffee when he heard the news that October. After decades arguing that life has no inherent meaning, here was the world's most prestigious literary honor declaring his work mattered. The ironies piled up beautifully. The prize committee praised his important literary production, which, with clear-sighted earnestness, illuminates the problems of the human conscience in our times. Translation: we're giving you history's biggest gold star for insisting gold stars don't mean anything.
For 2 months, Camus oscillated between pride and profound discomfort. Friends celebrated while he privately panicked. The colonial war in Algeria was intensifying daily, making any celebration seem obscene. His mother couldn't read his books or comprehend the honor, lost in her silent world. And philosophically, how could someone who'd built a career on authenticity accept being turned into an institution? His Nobel lecture tried to thread this needle. Rather than celebrate himself, Camus talked about the writer's responsibility to truth, to refusing comfortable lies, to bearing witness. He spoke of his generation, born into World War I's carnage and coming of age during World War II, now facing nuclear annihilation. His voice carried genuine anguish. I cannot live as a person without my art, yet I have never set that art above everything else.
The Swedish press conference became infamous. A student, presumably Algerian, stood and accused Camus of silence regarding French colonial atrocities. The atmosphere turned electric. Camus, exhausted and defensive, offered his tortured response about believing in justice but defending his mother first. The words would haunt him forever, quoted endlessly as proof of his moral failure or his honest humanity, depending on who was quoting. Back in Paris after Stockholm's spotlight, reality crashed down hard. Communist intellectuals published savage attacks, claiming the Nobel was bourgeois consolation for abandoning revolutionary politics. Algerian independence activists saw his prize as French cultural imperialism. Right-wing commentators expected him to use the platform to defend French Algeria. Everyone wanted him to choose sides clearly. He chose silence instead, retreating from public debates to work on The First Man. The Nobel Prize money bought him time and space to write, the ultimate irony. Capitalism rewarding its critic handsomely enough that he could criticize without distraction. Camus used the money to help Algerian refugees on both sides of the conflict, anonymous donations that wouldn't make headlines.
By early 1958, the Nobel laureate was living a strange dual life. Publicly, he was France's great moralist, invited to international conferences and asked to pronounce on every crisis. Privately, he was a sick man wrestling with depression,
chain-smoking through insomnia, paralyzed by the sense that his philosophy had prepared him for absurdity, but not for this specific, grinding absurdity of watching his homeland tear itself apart while the world expected wisdom he couldn't provide. The prize that was supposed to validate his life's work instead amplified his isolation. The working-class Algerian boy had climbed to the summit of literary prestige only to discover the view was just more absurdity, more meaninglessness, more humans expecting answers he'd spent his career insisting didn't exist. Sisyphus had reached the top of the hill, and the boulder was still waiting to roll back down. Chapter 10. The Manuscript in the Wreckage. The 1950s arrive like a slow dimming of lights. Camus' body is betraying him again. His lungs wheeze from decades of tuberculosis and chain-smoking. Insomnia stalks him nightly, and the migraine headaches that had plagued him since youth now arrive like clockwork, blinding and merciless. The philosopher who once wrote of embracing life fully now spends more time discussing mortality with doctors than meaning with fellow thinkers. "I am a machine condemned to devour experiences," he tells Maria Casares, and now the damned machine is breaking down. The Algerian crisis worries him more. His homeland, the sun-blasted coast where he'd played football and first tasted the absurd joy of existing, is now a war zone. The French settlers he'd grown up among are being driven out or killed. The Arab Algerians his boyhood friends had been are fighting for liberation with terrorist tactics that horrify him. Camus reads newspaper reports from Algiers and pretends not to notice how his hands shake. Writing becomes his refuge. The First Man languishes in draft form, its pages a chaotic excavation of memory. Camus writes about his father, the man who died before memory, trying to understand the absence that shaped everything. He writes about his mother's silence, finding in her muteness something profound about life's essential mysteries. He writes about playing football at sunset with Arab and French boys before politics divided them into enemies. By late 1959, Camus had become something he'd never imagined, an elder statesman of letters. Publishers treated him reverently. Young writers sought his blessing. Even former enemies wrote cordial letters, time softening old feuds. He'd become the grand old man of French literature at just 46, which felt both absurd and appropriate for someone who'd built his philosophy around life's fundamental absurdities. Then comes January 1960. Camus, at his house in Lourmarin, preparing to return to Paris. His publisher, Michel Gallimard, offers a ride, a casual invitation that becomes fate. Camus hesitates. He has a train ticket, prefers trains to cars. But Gallimard insists, and Camus, too polite to refuse again, accepts. They pack the Faisal Vega, a powerful sports car with luggage and manuscripts. The First Man manuscript goes into Camus' briefcase, a casual choice that becomes crucial. The crash happens on January 4, 1960, on a straight road near Ville-Blevin. The Faisal Vega hits a tree at high speed. Gallimard and his wife survive initially, though Michel dies days later. Camus dies instantly,
his neck broken, age 46. In his coat pocket, police find an unused train ticket. In his briefcase, 144 handwritten pages of The First Man survive intact, a manuscript pulled from wreckage that would be published 34 years later. At the funeral in Lourmarin Cemetery, a small crowd gathers. No state ceremony, no grand speeches, just as Camus would have wanted. Friends notice the absurdity immediately. The philosopher who'd argued we must imagine Sisyphus happy, killed on a straight road for no reason anyone could determine. Mechanical failure, driver error, fate, or pure randomness. The universe offered no explanation, staying true to its character. Back in Paris, Jean-Paul Sartre, estranged for years, writes a eulogy that captures their complicated friendship. He represented the admirable conjunction of a person, an action, and a work. The praise comes too late for reconciliation, another small absurdity in a universe full of them. Camus had spent his last years isolated from former allies, defending positions that satisfied no one, certain only that truth mattered more than belonging.
In Algiers, his mother learns of his death through neighbors. She cannot read the newspaper tributes or understand the international mourning. She sits in silence, as she always had, mourning a son who'd become famous, explaining what she'd always known without words, that life gives nothing freely, asks everything, and means exactly what we make of it. The woman who'd cleaned floors in silence had taught her son philosophy's deepest lesson without speaking a word. The unfinished manuscript haunts everyone who knew him. The First Man would have been his masterpiece, friends insisted, his answer to all the critiques. But perhaps its incompleteness is perfect, the final absurdist gesture. The philosopher who'd argued life has no inherent conclusion left his greatest work without an ending. Sisyphus never reaches the summit. The boulder keeps rolling. The work remains forever in process, like existence itself.
Chapter 11. The Prophet's Unlikely Resurrection. The ink was barely dry on Camus's obituaries when the canonization began. 1960s France, reeling from Algeria's independence and searching for moral clarity, suddenly found itself crawling with Camus admirers, or at least people who claimed his legacy. In Parisian cafes, American university seminars, and North African intellectual circles, arguments erupted over what the dead philosopher really meant. Had he been right about everything? Wrong about Algeria? Too principled or not principled enough? Sartre, now the undisputed king of French philosophy, spent the decade carefully positioning himself as Camus's opposite. Where Camus had demanded moral limits, Sartre embraced revolutionary necessity. Where Camus had warned against ideology, Sartre dove deeper into Marxism. The shadow debate between dead friend and living rival shaped a generation's understanding of engagement, though Camus couldn't respond anymore. The movement Camus left behind was fragmenting beautifully. In America, countercultural rebels read The Stranger as a manual for dropping out, missing entirely that Meursault was a critique, not a role model. In Algeria, newly independent intellectuals debated whether Camus' humanism had been genuine or just colonialism with a conscience. Meanwhile, European philosophers kept trying to claim his legacy for existentialism, despite Camus spending his career insisting he wasn't an existentialist at all. By the 1970s, Camus' ideas were undergoing the ultimate irony, becoming respectable. Universities taught the myth of Sisyphus alongside required readings. Publishers released his notebooks and unfinished works. Even conservatives began quoting him, using his anti-totalitarian writings while ignoring his anti-colonialism. The radical who'd challenged all comfortable positions was being made comfortable, his rough edges sanded smooth by academic respectability.
The real turning point came in the 1980s when post-colonial theory exploded. Edward Said's Orientalism and others dissected how Western intellectuals had written about colonized peoples. Camus became a test case. Was his humanism genuine, or was his defense of French Algerians just sophisticated racism? The debates grew heated, complicated by the fact that Camus himself was from a colonized place, poor and marginalized by metropolitan France. Then the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. Suddenly, Camus' warnings about revolutionary terror looked prescient. His refusal to excuse Soviet crimes because they promised utopia seemed vindicated. The philosopher who'd been mocked for refusing to choose between capitalism and communism had apparently been right that both systems could brutalize humans. Books about Camus proliferated. He was back in fashion, the anti-ideological voice for an age supposedly beyond ideology.
But history had a funny way of complicating Camus' resurrection. The 1994 publication of The First Man, assembled from those rescued manuscript pages, revealed a more complicated figure than either admirers or critics wanted. Here was Camus writing with heartbreaking beauty about French Algeria while barely mentioning Arab Algerians' perspectives. The humanist who'd preached universal values showed his own blindnesses. The saint had feet of clay, which somehow made him more human. By the 2000s, Camus occupied a strange position in intellectual history. Too radical for conservatives who quoted him against communism, too compromised for progressives who couldn't forgive his Algeria positions, too humanist for postmodernists who'd moved beyond universal values, yet somehow still read, still debated, still teaching new generations that meaning isn't given but created, and that creating it requires confronting life's fundamental absurdity honestly. The ghost in the machine was loose, and nobody, not the existentialists, not the post-colonialists, certainly not the dead philosopher himself, could control where absurdism went next. The boulder kept rolling, and we were all still trying to imagine Sisyphus happy, uncertain whether we'd understood the assignment.
Chapter 12. Absurdism Goes Global. The late 20th century didn't so much embrace Camus' absurdism as wrestle with it across continents and cultures. After Algeria's independence, his ideas went global, translated into dozens of languages, interpreted through countless cultural lenses. His image appeared on protest posters and in philosophy seminars. His quotes weaponized by everyone from anarchists to corporate motivational speakers. The universe's indifference, it turned out, translated beautifully. The existential boom of the 1960s swept Camus along despite his protests from beyond the grave. In America, college students read The Stranger between anti-war protests, finding in Mausal's alienation a mirror for their own. The summer, his lyrical essays about Algeria's landscape and Mediterranean philosophy became countercultural scripture. Even his difficult works like The Rebel found audiences among radicals trying to theorize revolution without terror.
Eastern Europe offered the most poignant reception. In communist Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary, intellectuals read Camus in secret, his anti-totalitarian writings offering philosophical resistance when political resistance meant death. Václav Havel, the dissident playwright who'd become Czech president, credited the myth of Sisyphus with sustaining him through prison. The absurd hero pushing his boulder became a metaphor for surviving oppression with dignity intact. Yet some of the most interesting developments came from places Camus never imagined reaching. In Japan, his philosophy merged with Buddhist concepts of emptiness and attachment, creating hybrid interpretations he'd probably find fascinating or horrifying. Latin American writers saw in his work echoes of their own magical realism, the universe's fundamental strangeness rendered through different literary techniques. African intellectuals grappled with his colonial legacy while finding value in his humanism. By the 1980s, Absurdism had escaped philosophy departments entirely. Filmmakers from Godard to the Coen brothers created absurdist masterpieces. Musicians from punk to hip-hop channeled Camusian alienation. Even corporate America got involved, self-help gurus twisting "Imagine Sisyphus happy" into positive thinking platitudes, completely missing that Sisyphus's happiness came from confronting meaninglessness, not denying it. The fall of communism created another Camus revival. Suddenly, his warnings about how ideologies justify atrocities looked prophetic. His insistence on limits, on refusing to sacrifice present humans for future utopias, resonated with societies emerging from totalitarian nightmares. The philosopher who'd been dismissed as politically naive in the 1950s was now hailed as morally sophisticated. Time had vindicated him, or at least parts of him. Through it all, the old divisions persisted. Leftists who admired his anti-fascism couldn't forgive his anti-communism. Liberals who praised his humanism couldn't reconcile his Algeria positions. Post-colonial critics who acknowledged his genuine poverty couldn't excuse his privileges as a European in colonial society. And actual working people, the ones who might most relate to his background, often found academic debates about him completely incomprehensible. The ultimate irony came when marketing executives discovered absurdism. By the 2000s, you could buy "Sisyphus was happy" t-shirts and coffee mugs. Advertisers used Camusian alienation to sell products promising authentic experiences. The philosophy of meaninglessness became just another lifestyle brand, proving yet again that capitalism could commodify absolutely anything, even philosophies explaining capitalism's spiritual emptiness. Through it all, Camus's fundamental insight kept returning like a persistent ghost. We live in a universe that doesn't care about us, and we must create meaning anyway through our choices and commitments. Every generation rediscovered this truth in its own crisis. The boulder kept rolling, and we kept pushing it. sometimes understanding why, sometimes just because pushing is what we do.
Chapter 13. Camus in the Digital Age. The 21st century was supposed to move beyond existentialism. With the internet connecting everyone and science explaining everything, absurdism seemed like yesterday's angst. But history, that eternal trickster, had other plans. As the new millennium unfolded, Camus staged a comeback so unexpected it would make a viral marketer jealous. Not as a dusty philosopher, but as the patron saint of burned-out millennials, doom-scrolling Gen Z, and anyone who'd ever stared at their smartphone wondering why nothing felt real anymore. The 2008 financial crisis served as absurdism's unlikely revival tour. As banks collapsed and governments bailed out billionaires while ordinary people lost homes, something curious happened. Sales of the myth of Sisyphus spiked. Suddenly, everyone from Occupy Wall Street protesters to laid-off office workers found themselves drawn to a French Algerian's 70-year-old essay about embracing meaninglessness. The irony was delicious. The same economic system Camus had critiqued was now driving people to his philosophy for comfort.
Social media became absurdism's natural habitat. Twitter users shared Camus quotes between doom-scrolling sessions about climate catastrophe. Instagram accounts posted aesthetically pleasing excerpts against sunsets, completely missing that Camus would have found Instagram's performative authenticity hilariously absurd. TikTok philosophers explained Sisyphean existence through 60-second skits about late capitalism, somehow making ancient Greek myths relevant to gig economy workers. The memes were relentless. Me pushing my boulder formats proliferated, juxtaposing Sisyphus with images of checking work emails at midnight, paying student loans forever, or trying to save the planet while corporations burned it down. Someone created an AI bot that generated Camus-style observations about modern life, producing gems like "One must imagine the Uber driver happy," that were simultaneously parody and profound truth.
Academia underwent its own Camus revival. Environmental philosophers applied his concept of revolt to climate activism, arguing we must rebel against ecological catastrophe even knowing we might fail. Feminist scholars examined his blind spots while finding value in his ethics of solidarity. Digital humanities professors analyzed how social media creates the exact alienation Camus described. We're simultaneously hyper-connected and profoundly isolated. The workplace became particularly fertile ground for absurdist interpretation. Tech workers formed philosophy reading groups discussing the rebel between sprints. Remote employees related deeply to Mousseau's emotional detachment during Zoom meetings. The corporate world's insistence on purpose-driven work and meaningful impact while grinding workers into burnout seemed like performance art illustrating Camusian absurdity. Mental health discourse discovered Camus accidentally. Therapists found his philosophy surprisingly therapeutic for depression and anxiety. The key insight: accepting life's meaninglessness can be liberating rather than devastating. Existential dread becomes manageable when you stop expecting the universe to make sense. Imagine Sisyphus happy became a mantra for pushing through without expecting resolution.
Climate anxiety brought Camus' most unexpected relevance. Young people facing ecological catastrophe found in Absurdism a framework for action without hope. We fight climate change knowing we might fail, choosing rebellion against despair precisely because the universe doesn't care. The boulder is melting ice caps and species extinction, and we push anyway because pushing is how we create meaning in meaninglessness.
The pandemic made everyone existentialists, whether they wanted to be or not. Lockdowns forced confrontation with life's fragility and randomness. Essential workers risked death for minimum wage, while others zoomed in pajamas. The absurdity was unavoidable. Camus' quotes circulated like prayer for the post-religious, offering solidarity in shared meaninglessness. We were all Sisyphus now, pushing boulders uphill while wearing masks. By the 2020s, Camus occupied the strange position of being everywhere and nowhere. His face on bookstore displays and Instagram story backgrounds. His ideas simplified into self-help mantras and complicated by academic critique. The philosopher who'd wanted to help people live authentically in absurd times had become content for the algorithm. His rebellion against meaninglessness just another thing to scroll past.
Yet somehow his core insight survived the digital flattening. Buried under memes and merchandise, the truth persisted. We're alive in an indifferent universe, and that indifference is precisely what makes our choices matter. The struggle itself is the point. We create meaning through rebellion, through refusing despair, through solidarity with other boulders pushers. Whether expressed in 280 characters or 300 pages, the message endured. As the 2020s rolled on, with ecological collapse looming and inequality spiraling, Camus' questions felt more urgent than ever. How do we live authentically in systems designed for inauthenticity? How do we rebel without becoming what we fight? How do we imagine ourselves happy while pushing boulders that never reach the summit? The answers remained as elusive as they'd been in 1942. One thing was certain: the old absurdist was still relevant, and this time he had hashtags.
Chapter 14. The Contradictions We Inherit. For all his clarity, Camus left behind a minefield of contradictions and uncomfortable questions, the intellectual equivalent of a brilliant unfinished symphony, with some notes persistently off-key. The man who saw life's absurdity with crystalline vision somehow missed how his own privileged position in colonial Algeria shaped his blind spots, how his universal humanism sometimes erased specific injustices, and how his beautiful prose about Mediterranean brotherhood glossed over whose beaches those were and who'd been displaced from them. The 21st century became a reckoning with these contradictions. Post-colonial scholars dissected the first man, finding in its lyrical nostalgia for French Algeria a troubling erasure of Arab Algerian perspectives. The working-class boy from Belcourt had genuine poverty, they acknowledged, but also genuine privilege as a European in a colonial system. His famous Nobel Prize statement about defending his mother before justice revealed something uncomfortable. Sometimes our particular loves conflict with universal principles, and Camus chose honestly over consistency.
Then there was his treatment of women. particularly glaring for someone who preached authenticity. His affairs were numerous and often overlapping. He loved women intensely, but seemingly couldn't sustain fidelity. His wife, Francine, suffered breakdowns while he maintained his relationship with Maria Caceres. His philosophical commitment to truth apparently had boundaries when it came to personal relationships. The absurd hero struggling for authenticity was also just a guy who couldn't stop cheating. His political positioning aged poorly in some ways, presciently in others. Camus' refusal to align with either Cold War power looked cowardly to 1950s activists, but wise to later generations who witnessed both systems' failures. His warnings about revolutionary terror resonated after Soviet and Maoist atrocities became undeniable. Yet his paralysis over Algeria looked less like principled complexity and more like inability to accept that decolonization required his side to lose power.
Perhaps most troublingly, Camus underestimated how thoroughly his philosophy could be depoliticized. He'd intended absurdism as a call to ethical rebellion, to creating meaning through solidarity and resistance. Instead, it often became excuse for apathy. If nothing matters, why fight injustice? If the universe is indifferent, why not be indifferent too? His philosophy required subtle reading to avoid nihilistic conclusions he'd explicitly rejected, but subtlety wasn't social media's strong suit. The very accessibility that made his work beloved created problems. The Stranger read as cool alienation rather than critique of alienation. The myth of Sisyphus became self-help rather than philosophical challenge. His complex positions on violence, colonialism, and revolution got flattened into sound bites that would have horrified him. Every generation claimed him while misunderstanding him differently.
Yet, for all these problematic elements, Camus' core insights remained valuable. His insistence that recognizing meaninglessness doesn't excuse cruelty. His demand for rebellion against injustice, even without guarantee of success. His celebration of Mediterranean sensuality and physical joy as counterweights to philosophical despair. These ideas survived critique because they addressed something persistently true about human experience. The greatest testament to Camus' complicated legacy might be this. 60 years after his death, we still can't resolve his contradictions. Progressives invoke his humanism while criticizing his colonial blindness. Conservatives quote his anti-totalitarianism while ignoring his socialism. Existentialists claim him, he rejected them. Activists use his philosophy, he might have disagreed. The thinker who wanted clarity left confusion, which is perhaps appropriately absurd. In the end, Camus' most enduring contribution might be the questions his contradictions raise. How do we pursue universal values while respecting particular identities? Can we rebel against injustice without becoming tyrannical ourselves? Is it possible to love what's ours without defending injustice committed in its name? These aren't just theoretical puzzles. They're the live tensions crackling through every social movement, moral debate, and honest attempt to live ethically. Today, the old philosopher's contradictions won't resolve themselves. His privilege and poverty, his insight and blindness, his courage and cowardice exist together, as human and flawed as the absurd existence he described. We inherit not answers but better questions, not solutions but honest acknowledgement that living meaningfully in meaningless times requires constant struggle without guaranteed triumph. The boulder keeps rolling, and we keep pushing it, aware now that some of us have heavier boulders and some of us are pushing them uphill on unequal terrain. Camus would probably appreciate the honesty of that admission, even if it complicated his own vision.
Chapter 15. Absurdism in the Age of Everything. If Camus were to materialize in our world today, perhaps summoned by the collective exhaustion of doom-scrollers or the eerie glow of algorithmic feeds, he'd find both his worst fears and his fundamental insights confirmed in equal measure. The 21st century has become a funhouse mirror of his prophecies. Billionaires colonizing space while workers can't afford healthcare. Artificial intelligence threatening to make human meaning obsolete. And climate change proving that humanity's relationship with nature is more absurd and broken than even he imagined. Take the modern condition. Camus wrote about alienation in colonial Algeria and occupied France. But even he couldn't have imagined the surreal detachment of today's hyper-connected loneliness. The dating app user swiping through humans reduced to profiles. The content creator performing authenticity for engagement metrics. The knowledge worker attending Zoom meetings where everyone's camera is off, talking to black squares in pajamas. Alienation has become so normalized, we've gamified it, turned it into lifestyle content, made it aesthetic.
Then there's the spectacle of meaning-making in late capitalism, which would make Camus' head spin faster than a TikTok feed. The same system creating profound alienation sells it back as wellness and self-care. Corporations offer purpose-driven missions while union-busting. Billionaires promise to save humanity while hoarding wealth that could actually help. Even rebellion gets branded and sold, the resistance slogan printed on fast fashion t-shirts made in sweatshops. Climate change presents the most brutal confirmation of absurdism's relevance. Camus wrote about humanity's broken relationship with nature, our tendency to exploit what sustains us. Now we're living that catastrophe in real time. The absurdity is staggering. We know we're destroying our only home, we have the technology to stop, but systems of profit and power make action nearly impossible. Future generations will inherit devastation, yet we scroll past climate news to watch cat videos. Sisyphus's boulder has become melting ice caps, and we're all pushing against physics and politics simultaneously.
Yet for all this bleak confirmation of his insights, our world would baffle Camus in crucial ways. He believed in universal human solidarity, but identity has fractured into infinite categories. He imagined collective rebellion, but algorithms isolate us into personalized realities. He trusted that confronting absurdity would lead to ethical clarity, but we've somehow monetized even existential dread. The influencer posting aesthetically pleasing breakdowns. The meditation app commodifying the peace that should come from accepting meaninglessness. Perhaps most surprisingly, Camus might be stunned by absurdism's cultural victory alongside its philosophical defeat. Everyone knows life is meaningless now. It's not controversial anymore, just background noise. Yet this widespread acceptance hasn't led to the ethical rebellion he imagined. Instead, it's become excuse for passive consumption, for numbing rather than confronting, for doom-scrolling instead of acting. The system learned to absorb its critics by making critique another product to consume.
And yet, in the cracks of this system, Camus' ghost keeps stirring. Climate activists blocking traffic, knowing they'll probably fail, but acting anyway. Essential workers organizing despite retaliation. Young people choosing community over career advancement. These aren't grand revolutions, but they prove the underlying truth he identified. Meaning emerges through rebellion, through pushing boulders uphill, even knowing they'll roll back down. The old philosopher's final surprise might be this: the most radical applications of his ideas are coming not from intellectuals, but from ordinary people facing impossible odds. Healthcare workers through the pandemic, teachers in underfunded schools, parents raising children toward a burning future. They're all living absurdism, whether they've read Camus or not, creating meaning through commitment to others, despite knowing the universe doesn't care. As we face down ecological collapse, algorithmic control, and spiraling inequality, Camus' fundamental question remains as urgent as ever. How do we live authentically in systems designed to make us inauthentic? How do we rebel without despair? How do we create meaning in meaninglessness? The answers keep changing with each technological disruption, but the question won't go away. The boulder keeps rolling, and we keep pushing it. Sometimes knowing why, sometimes just because pushing is what humans do. And maybe that's enough. Maybe it has to be. The pandemic made everyone existentialists, whether they wanted to be or not. Lockdowns forced confrontation with life's fragility and randomness. Essential workers risked death for minimum wage, while others zoomed in pajamas. The absurdity was unavoidable. Camus' quotes circulated like prayer for the post-religious, offering solidarity in shared meaninglessness. We were all Sisyphus now, pushing boulders uphill while wearing masks. By the 2020s, Camus occupied the strange position of being everywhere and nowhere. His face on bookstore displays and Instagram story backgrounds. His ideas simplified into self-help mantras and complicated by academic critique. The philosopher who'd wanted to help people live authentically in absurd times had become content for the algorithm. His rebellion against meaninglessness just another thing to scroll past. Then came the war years, where occupied France became his laboratory for testing ideas against brutal reality. He wrote The Stranger while working for the resistance, proving that recognizing life's absurdity doesn't mean abandoning ethics. The famous opening line, "Mother died today, or maybe yesterday, I don't know," shocked readers into confronting their own comfortable lies. The post-war years. Paris became Camus' stage as he published The Myth of Sisyphus, that revolutionary essay insisting we must imagine the boulder pusher happy. Picture him there, chain-smoking at Café des Fleurs, utterly consumed by the question, what if accepting meaninglessness is the first step toward genuine freedom? Algeria's independence struggle broke his heart. The Nobel Prize confused him. And through it all, personal contradictions piled up. The moralist who couldn't stay faithful. The anti-colonialist who couldn't fully support decolonization. The champion of authenticity who performed for audiences. Yet even in his contradictions, Camus kept insisting that honesty matters more than consistency. His sudden death in a car crash, the unused train ticket in his pocket, seemed like the universe having the last absurd laugh. The philosopher of meaninglessness killed meaninglessly on a straight road in good weather. Even his ending was absurd. After his death, history took his ideas everywhere. Student protesters quoted him. Dissidents surviving totalitarianism found courage in his work. Today, his ghost lingers in climate activism, in burned-out millennials recognizing their alienation, in anyone who's ever pushed a boulder uphill knowing it'll roll back down and chosen to push anyway.
So why does Camus matter tonight? Because whether you're nodding off after doom-scrolling or just wondering why everything feels simultaneously important and pointless, his central insight remains. The universe doesn't care, which means we're free to care intensely about what we choose. We create meaning through rebellion, through solidarity, through refusing despair even when despair makes perfect sense. The answers are still unfolding, one pushed boulder at a time. Now, as the absurdity of existence settles into comfortable darkness, let's leave Camus where we found him. On an Algerian beach at sunset, football under his arm, lungs struggling with each breath, smiling at the sheer improbable joy of being alive for no reason at all. The rest, dear listener, is up to us to make meaningful.
These journeys into history help you unwind. Do us a kindness. Tap that like button, whisper subscribe, and leave a comment below. What stays with you about Camus' story, and who should we explore next? Now, close your eyes, let the absurdity drift, and we'll meet again soon for another story. Sleep well, and remember, we must imagine you happy.